Let's talk about the Terence Crawford, Canelo Alvarez talks. According to multiple reports, we are closing in on a deal for Canelo to face Crawford. Both Canelo and Crawford were in London this past weekend. For Canelo, it was the first time he's been photographed with Turki Al-Sheikh. Those two have had some bad blood in the past. Terence Crawford was there a day later. This would reportedly take place, Keith, in the fall of this year. So do you believe that we are going to get Canelo against Crawford in 2025?
I do, Chris. I think it's a fight that the public wants. We've talked about the fight many times on the podcast. There was a point when I was like, I don't really need to see that. He's going to move up at that point, he was going to move up three weight classes because it was before Terence Crawford fought at 154 pounds. And I was like, I admire him for wanting to do it, but it's a bridge. It seemed like a bridge too far to me at the time. What's happened with Canelo since then kind of makes me believe that Crawford has more of a chance to win the fight than I once thought, for whatever that's worth. Um, he, I'm not going to say people were pretty hard on Crawford for how he fought against Madrimov, but Madrimov is pretty good, and he's a career-long junior middleweight. Wasn't an easy fight, wasn't his best performance. I'm sure he would tell everyone that. Um, but I don't know where Canelo is now. The one thing I will say is Canelo is a chess master because he has convinced Turki Al-Sheikh and a lot of other people that he doesn't want this fight. And in some ways, he probably doesn't, in the sense that it's a high risk, low reward for him. Because if he wins, well, he was a welterweight a year and a half ago, so who cares, right? Even though he's, arguably the best fighter of this generation, who cares really? Because he's too small. And if you lose, well, that's not going to look good on your resume. I'm sure that is at least in the back of Canelo's mind. But by playing this the way that he played it, and then going and fighting Jaime Munguia and fighting Edgar Berlanga and making a lot of money for both of those fights, he's now put himself in a position where he's going to make not eight figures, he's going to make nine figures to fight Terence Crawford. So kudos to Canelo Alvarez, who again is playing elite level chess. And kudos to Crawford too, because Crawford pushed for this fight. He basically said, I don't want to fight anyone else except Canelo Alvarez. And he's earned that right. I mean, he's at the tippy top of the sport. And if he only wants to fight one guy at 37 years old or walk away, and he's comfortable with how much money he has, he made very good money, obviously, then it's within his right to do that. But for boxing fans, this has captivated their imagination for whatever it's worth, and they want to see it. So if anyone doesn't think that it's a competitive fight and doesn't think Crawford has much of a chance, it's going to be a big event, and it'll more than likely be in the United States. So it's going to be a big fight, and it'll generate a lot of mainstream attention, and the sport needs fights like that. So let's have at it.
I don't think any boxer will be known as a better businessman than Floyd Mayweather was for many years during his career, really from his exit from Top Rank all the way to the end. But Canelo has proven to be really, really good at it. He is a great understander of when he has leverage, and he uses that leverage expertly. He had leverage back in 2018 when DAZN burst onto the scene and they needed to make a big splash. They needed a big signing, and he parlayed that into that massive deal. When he could get out of that deal, he did, use that leverage, got a good deal with Eddie Hearn and Matchroom. Years later, used the same leverage, got a great deal with PBC to do this, the first couple of fights, which generated huge money, and the money he's made over the last couple of years working with Al Heyman. Now here he is, after going through 2024, where he fought some marketable fights, some lucrative fights, but fights that really didn't present him any risk whatsoever of losing. Jaime Munguia was never going to beat him. Edgar Berlanga was never going to beat him. Now he goes into 2025, and I think Canelo kind of knows that, maybe those days of fighting those guys are behind him. You look at the potential matches that could be made. He's not going to fight Jermall Charlo. He's not going to fight Diego Pacheco. He's not going to fight Christian Mbili. Like, those kind of marketable, low-risk opponents aren't out there. So lo and behold, he appears at the Ring Magazine Awards. He's got his arm around Turki Al-Sheikh. Like, There seems to be a partnership brewing between these two power brokers in boxing. And it to your point, it is going to result in Canelo Alvarez most likely finishing 2025 in the low nine figures in money made. He is to be applauded for how he's leveraged his talent, his popularity, the fragmented nature of boxing. He has done a remarkable job at doing all that. The question is, are both guys, do you think, gonna wait until the fall for something like this fight to happen, or do you think we're gonna see interim fights for both of them in between?
Well, I think I'm going to make your day, probably your week, and
Oh
probably
boy.
your month, and maybe your year. Because it would sure seem that Canelo Alvarez, being the elite level chess master that he has become, is probably going to fight William Skull in May. So you can make your t-shirts and whatever else you're going to do on your website there. And he's this is what I mean by he's a chess master, because the IBF took his title basically and he said, well, you can have whatever, but everyone knows I'm the undisputed champion. And now William Skull has it, and now he's going to say, well, if Terence Crawford wants to fight for all the belts, I got to go get my other belt from William Skull, and he's going to make 8 figures for that fight. I mean, holy Jesus, and this is the, like you said, taking advantage of the fragmented, disorganized shit show that boxing is for the most part. And now he's going to benefit from it not once but twice. Now the Crawford fight's a real fight. I don't think William Skull, unless he comes into the ring with a baseball bat, has any chance to beat Canelo Alvarez. Be that as it
How
may, he's going
dare you? How
to get
dare
banned.
you
Banned.
disrespect
I'll probably be banned from the podcast moving forward. But
the
um,
undefeated Cuban via Germany
yeah,
William Skull?
well, that was a scintillating performance against Vladimir Shishkin, if I've ever seen one. Uh, but good. He's going to make some money too. I mean, good. This is what boxing is about. This is why people argue that the four belt system benefits fighters, and it does, because it gives people paydays and ways to provide for their families that otherwise wouldn't exist. No one would know who William Skull is if he didn't have the IBF title, and certainly if he does wind up fighting Canelo in May, well, a lot of people are going to know who he is. And honestly, the about going back to what you said before about how much money he made and how good the business was for him in 2024. Uh, the Skull fight will do some business. It won't do as well as the Berlanga fight or the Munguia fight. But think about where we were. So let's just say this time last year, Chris. We knew he was headed toward the Munguia fight at that point. It was a fight that had been brewing for a long time. They're both Mexican, etc. It does well on pay per view. Well, it wasn't an overwhelming success on pay per view, but it did very well. Um, he kind of admitted that he carried Munguia, right? That he could have knocked him
He didn't
out, and
kinda. He admitted it. He
he
said it.
admitted that he knocked. Yeah. Then he goes and fights someone we would all probably consider a little worse than Munguia, right? And that's fair. A guy that no one thought had any chance whatsoever to beat Canelo Alvarez. We couldn't understand what Canelo was thinking and going forward with that fight, and thinking that it was going to do better maybe than the Munguia fight, and it did better. It did more pay-per-view buys than the Munguia fight when he fought another Mexican on Cinco de Mayo weekend. He fought a Puerto Rican around Mexican Independence Day, and it did better. And Berlanga came out of it looking good as well, because he went the distance with Canelo, and everyone thought he was going to get knocked out. Now, he got knocked down, but he got up and he finished the fight, and he actually probably, he made nearly $10 million for that fight, if people can believe that. That's what happened. And
9.8 million is what I heard he
there you
made.
go.
Yeah.
So he did well for himself that night too, because now he's a guy who went the distance with Canelo Alvarez, and did better against Canelo Alvarez than most people thought. Maybe better than Munguia did, who people perceived to be a better fighter, and obviously now has been knocked out rather surprisingly. But I mean, Canelo's going to fight Munguia, Berlanga, and William Skull in succession, and make a more money than any of us could ever dream of for doing it, and then is going to make even more money than that, all of that combined, for fighting Terence Crawford, who, while great and a generational great and one of the best fighters that we've had the privilege to cover, but who frankly is started at junior lightweight, and he's really a welterweight.
I look, it's masterful. It really is by Canelo Alvarez. What do you think about Crawford though? Does he sit out for 2 full years before we get to Canelo?
I don't really have a definitive answer on that, but I don't think so. I think what would be smart for Terence Crawford, just get him someone reasonable to fight, because the one thing that Terence Crawford has done extremely well is fight off of long layoffs and perform at the top level. He's accustomed to that and seems comfortable with that much more so than other fighters. So the inactivity hasn't affected his performances all that much, but I wouldn't recommend continuing to do that if I were him, especially because you're going up in weight. So if I were him, what I would like to do for my next fight is just get the fight contracted somewhere a little above the middleweight limit, get to that weight in the way that you feel comfortable in terms of adding some muscle mass and everything. See how you feel at that weight. I wouldn't want to find out how I feel at that higher weight when Canelo Alvarez is in front of me. I would rather do it against someone
Mhm.
at a much lower level, and they'll pay him. I mean, it's a reasonable ask of Crawford to want to go fight someone and just get some rounds in and everything to get himself prepared for that type of fight. I wouldn't, if I were him, I wouldn't. I mean, because think about how long of a layoff that would be. That would be if that fight happens in September, you're talking about a 13-month layoff at 37 years old, and he'd be almost 38 at that point. Um, I wouldn't do that.
Yeah, it's a long time. Yeah, I was got my years wrong there. It would be a little over a year
Yeah,
for his layoff. I
because he
just
fought August 3rd, right? Yeah.
yeah, I'm trying to think of who makes any kind of sense. Maybe it's a conversation for another day, but like you got to be very careful if you're going to take a fight above 160 pounds because
Yeah.
it's a new weight range. Having only fought once at 54, I mean, we've seen him. I'm sure he can put on the weight. He's a long guy. Like I'm sure he can fill out the frame well enough, but got to be careful who you select. Can't be selecting a puncher. Can't be selecting anybody really dangerous. You can't risk that bread. It's got to be. Remember when Oscar fought Stevie Forbes before he fought Floyd Mayweather?
Well, I remember when he fought Felix Sturm and he lost.
Yeah, yeah. It gave him that bad boy. Poor
Yeah.
Felix Sturm. Lost that one.